Good evening and welcome to tonight's Geo Talk. I'm Abby Hayward and I'm the Assistant Editor at Canadian Geographic. Before I introduce our guest this evening, I'd like to note that the Royal Canadian Geographical Society acknowledges that our offices are located on the unceded territories of the Algonquin peoples who have been the guardians of and in relationship with these lands for thousands of years. We further acknowledge and recognise that our work reaches across all of the distinct First Nations, Métis homelands, and Inuit Nunavut, and for this we are grateful. Tonight we're joined by Dr. Suzanne Simard, a professor of forest ecology at UBC and world-leading expert and pioneer on tree connectivity and communication. Her newest book, which came out this week on May 4th, it's just behind me, Finding the Mother Tree, takes readers on an intimate journey of groundbreaking scientific discovery. Simard is a lifelong storyteller describing her work in a way that is both humorous and deeply emotional. Linking her research to her personal experiences, she recounts her life's work uncovering the wood wide web. That's a bit of a tongue twister. The underground mycelium network that connects all the trees and plants within a forest. A network that allows them to share not only nutrients, but information, all of which originates from the hubs called mother trees. Dr. Simard will gladly take questions following her presentation, so please do comment as we go along in the links in YouTube and Facebook, wherever you're watching, and we'll ask them after. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Abby. So thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey through my book, just lightly. And before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, Sinixt, and Okanagan First Nations in British Columbia. I'm just going to take you on a little bit of a journey here for about 20 or 30 minutes. And so this is just a map of where I live. This is British Columbia on the left-hand side. And you can see that it's a very diverse area based on the colors. Those are all different ecosystem types. And if you look on the right-hand side, which is a global map, you can see British Columbia is that blue area, which is considered temperate forests. So British Columbia really is the home of the coastal temperate rainforests, the inland temperate rainforests, and then a bunch of other temperate forests as well that are a little drier and colder. And we just have a little tip of the boreal, which then stretches right across Canada. And this diversity in British Columbia comes from the mountains and the rivers that define this place. And then as well, the ocean, or proximity to the Pacific Ocean, which sends cool, moist air across these mountains, which causes a range of rainfall patterns and great diversity. And associated with this, of course, is our First Nations, and the diversity of the First Nations in British Columbia. It follows the diversity of the terrain because it is about the land. And so we are home to about 200 First Nations and about 30 of the language families from across Canada here in British Columbia. So there's a great diversity, a long history. And, the records sort of indicate that most of these First Nations have been here for at least 10,000 years. On Haida Gwaii, which is in that north upper west coast area, about 14,000 years. So there's a long history of culture.
Hello, sorry to cut in to the talk there. We were just having some technical difficulties with Suzanne's slides. So if you could just hold on 1 second, and then the map that she was talking about will pop up and we can see the geography of the area that she was talking about. So Hello again, Abby here. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties at the moment. If you could just bear with us, hopefully we'll have Suzanne back on in no time at all. Thank you so much for your patience this evening. Thank you. Oh, are we back? We're back. Okay, I'm so sorry everybody that's watching. Thank you so much for bearing with us as we have navigated the technical world that we live in. Hopefully this isn't the first time this has happened, and it's not going to be the last. So Suzanne, maybe you can start the presentation from the beginning and share your screen again.
Well, I'm not sure when I shared. Oh, there we go. There's the screen. Okay, I'm so sorry, everybody. Okay, here we go again. I guess I unlinked when I shared. All right, well, welcome to my talk. I'm talking today about my book. It's a memoir called Finding the Mother Tree. And this is really a memoir about my scientific studies and how my life kind of followed along in lockstep with my studies. So in the next slide, can we go to the next slide? I'm not sure if I'm sharing my screen or not. All I can see is myself. Okay, everyone can see and hear me, but I can't see my own slides. Okay, so, okay, here we go. So this slide is a map. I hope you can see this map. On the left-hand side of this map, there's a map of British Columbia, and you can see it's very colorful. That means that the forests there are very diverse. We have about 13 different forest types. They're all considered temperate forests. So there's inland temperate rainforests, there's coastal rainforests, and then there's a whole bunch of other drier and cooler forests as well, including boreal forest up in the upper right-hand side. And you can see on the right-hand side of this that there's another map of the globe. And you can see where British Columbia, it's that blue area. And across the rest of Canada is the boreal forest. So the boreal forest, of course, goes straight across Canada, and then there's a bit of temperate rainforest in the eastern, or temperate forest in the eastern part of the province. So this diversity comes from the mountains and in British Columbia, as well as this proximity to the Pacific Ocean. And so the warm air and the precipitation from the ocean moves across the province and basically dumps across the mountains and creates these incredible forests. So in the next slide, if we can move to the next slide. The next slide is a map of actually the First Nations in British Columbia. And you can see that there's a great number of First Nations in our province. And this is because the landscape is so diverse. In fact, we have about 200 nations in British Columbia, of which about 30 of the language families actually occur in BC. And, this is, as I said, it's correlated with our landscape. Where I am right now, I'm actually in Nelson, British Columbia, and I'm on the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan nations. So I'm going to go to the next slide, please. This next slide just shows some of the mountains and the rivers that occur in the western part of Canada. You can see that the rivers are big and the valleys are deep and the forests are lush and they're highly integrated. Next slide, please. And I grew up in these forests. So I grew up in the interior rainforests, which are considered some of the iconic old growth forests. So the interior rainforests are over by the Rocky Mountains. There's a series of mountain ranges where a lot of rainfall comes down, and we have some of the most productive forests in the world here. And they're almost as productive as those in the coastal areas. Next slide, please. And the rivers that run in the valley bottoms of these mountains are what I know of as salmon rivers. And so the salmon come and spawn every year with their great abundance every 4 years. And some of that salmon ends up in the forest and fertilizes the forest. Next slide, please. So when the salmon spawn, how do they make it into the forest? Well, there's a lot of big mammals that actually eat the salmon, grizzly bears being one of them. And so they actually will harvest up, in a single day, a bear like this can actually take about 170 salmon right into the forest. And there they eat the salmon. They particularly like the brains and the organs because they're very rich in energy, and they leave a lot of the flesh to decay. And that decaying salmon actually ends up in the soil, and ultimately the nitrogen from the salmon ends up in the trees. Next slide, please. So I grew up in these iconic forests. And so where salmon and trees and especially cedar are just a way of life. And this is where my family settled. So my family came from France. We were immigrants, landed in Quebec near Trois-Rivières. My great-grandfather was a logger, and they moved ultimately across British Columbia and were horse logging in the Kootenay region of the province. And this is actually on the Shuswap River, where the Simard family actually settled. And this picture is of a Splatsin Nation man who is harvesting salmon from the Shuswap River. And you can see that there's a weir here. This is one of the many very ingenious fishing technologies that were developed by the various nations across the province to harvest food for themselves. Next slide, please. So my family, when they settled in this area, became horse loggers. And so they logged in the mountains around these big rivers, and they selectively logged. They would just take out, white pine basically, and then eventually cedar poles, which were used for telephone poles. And in this picture is actually a river drive. And on these logs is my grandfather, Grandpa Henry, who is the guy in the white hat on the left. Next to him is his son, Odie, and on the right is his brother, my great uncle, Wilfred. And they are trying to move these logs down the river. This is called the Skookumchuck Narrows of Shuswap River. After they've done the logging for the season and moved the logs where they stay over winter at the river mouth, and then they send them down the chucks to the nearest river. So this is how I grew up. I grew up around horse logging, selective logging, and it was very, dangerous and intensive work, but I absolutely loved it. And this is how I got to know forests. Next slide, please. And ultimately, I went on and studied forestry. I went to university. Although I didn't know that forestry was really a field, I was accepted into the University of British Columbia forestry program and got a job in my first summer for a logging company. And I was actually, kind of horrified and surprised that they didn't do selective logging like I grew up knowing. That was when clear cutting started. And you can see on the right-hand side is this clear cut. It's actually on Vancouver Island. And my job was to try to repopulate these clear cuts with seedlings, which was, a difficult job. Next slide, please. And it was around this time, clear cut logging was really taking off, and there were a lot of protests against this. And so one of the famous ones that you probably most have heard about is what is now called the War in the Woods from the 1980s. And then the Nachanlith Nation on Vancouver Island were protesting against the plans to clear cut Mears Island off the west coast. And ultimately they were joined by protesters from non-governmental NGOs, Greenpeace, Forest Ethics, eventually became Forest Ethics. And out of this were a lot of negotiations that resulted in the Great Bear Rainforest. So the Great Bear Rainforest is actually shown in the lower part of this picture. This is an area of it that is open to harvesting. Not, of course, the whole thing is not open to harvesting, but you can see that there's still harvesting going on. And there are still a lot of issues around this, even though, there is a lot of protection as well. Next slide, please. And so back to my job. So I wasn't out there protesting. I was instead still in school, but my job was to try to figure out how to regrow these clear cuts. And I was struggling with this standard practice, which was to plant maybe usually it was one species, either Douglas fir or lodgepole pine or spruce. And then these stands were weeded out of the native plants. So native birches and aspens and cottonwoods and huckleberries, devil's club and so on was either herbicided or cut out or in some way reduced so that we could create these conifer plantations that were free to grow or free of competition. And what I started noticing in my work was that these plantations were actually had higher incidence of disease and insect infestations. Next slide, please. So, for example, this is actually a picture showing next of the mountain pine beetle that has infested a pure stand of lodgepole pine that's been planted in a mixed forest of subboreal spruce forest that is a lot, it itself is a lot less diverse than the native forest. And also these particular trees were a little bit off-site, not quite matched to the local provenances, and they were preferentially attacked by the beetle. And ultimately, the mountain pine beetle, in response to warming climatic conditions, fire suppression, and later on planting of lodgepole pine spread across a large part of British Columbia, killing forests over 18 million hectares and moving into the United States to kill ultimately 40 million hectares of trees. And even today, the beetle is still moving across Canada in the boreal and moving into the hybrids with jack pine as well. But I was interested in what was going on below ground, the pathogens that might be infecting plants below ground. So in the next slide, I became really interested in the sort of the community organisms in the soil and how were we upsetting the balance between all these organisms. And I became interested in how other fungi, including mycorrhizal fungi, actually interacted with the pathogenic fungi. And mycorrhizas are actually mutualistic symbionts. That means that the tree and the fungus join in a cooperative association where the tree provides photosynthetic energy in exchange for nutrients and water that the fungi pick up from the soil, and they go into this exchange. And it turns out that at the same time, a scientist, as I was discovering this, a scientist in next part of the slide, please, in the United Kingdom was looking at pine seedlings in root boxes in the laboratory, and his name was Sir David Reed. And he had discovered that these pine seedlings could be linked together in a network. And he would label one of the plants with carbon-14 and could see that this carbon-14 actually moved from one seedling to the next through this mycorrhizal fungi. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just a picture of the mycorrhizal linkages that the hyphae or the mycelium that can actually link two roots together. These are two root tips with these hyphae joining them together. And there is so much of this hyphae in the soil that you can have 100 kilometers of these hyphae coating every soil particle, every soil pore to pick up these nutrients and water that are actually quite scarce and hard for plants to get to. And so, yeah, they pack into the soil to do their job of gathering up these scarce resources. And it turns out that these hyphae can actually move stuff around as well as just colonizing the seedlings with mycorrhizas. Next slide, please. So I wanted to find out what these networks that David Reed had discovered in the laboratory, did they exist in our forests? Would they be responsible if we're disrupting them for disease and infestations? And if that was the case, how did they do this? And so I started out in these Douglas fir forests. These are primary old growth forests, uneven age forests, meaning that there are old trees. In this picture, that these Douglas firs, these old ones would be about 300 years old. And in the understory, there are different ages of trees coming up underneath. So all the way from seedlings to saplings to intermediate trees to these old trees. And so we went into about 6 of these forests and we made maps of what the network would look like. So next slide, please. And back to the previous slide, please. And so what we did is we went into those forests and we kind of pulled back the forest floor and we gathered up all of the fungal material that we could find and we sequenced it using DNA tools. So we could actually identify individual fungi and individual trees and which fungi or which individual fungal genets were linking trees together. And in this map, these round circles represent trees, and the darker and bigger the circle, the bigger and older the tree. And the lines in between are these fungal linkages that link the trees together. There's a few things I want you to note from this map. First of all, pretty much every tree is linked to every other tree in the forest. That was a huge discovery, and it was actually a big leap forward for us to understand what these networks look like in the forest. And keep in mind, we only looked at one species of fungus in this particular map. There are about 100 species that would have occurred in this forest at the same time. So this map, it's a real map, but it actually is an underrepresentation of the connection that exists in that forest. So another thing I want you to notice, not just is every tree connected to every other tree, but the biggest, oldest trees are the most highly connected. You can see they have the most lines coming out of them connecting to the other trees. In fact, one of these trees is linked to about 90% of all the other trees in the forest. So we also wanted to know then, what do these linkages do? And we went on and did a whole series of studies trying to figure out, how these networks influence the forest. Did it influence the regeneration of the forest? And so I had graduate students going and putting in seeds, allowing them to germinate around the old growth trees where they were linked into the network of the old trees or not, and compared them. And we found that the survival where these seedlings could link into the networks was far higher than where they were not linked. And at the same time, these old trees were transmitting tiny amounts of carbon, water, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus into these little seedlings. And this, we think, accounted for some of their increased survival and growth. There were a lot of other questions we asked. The next question we asked was, well, if they can actually promote the regeneration of seedlings, could they actually promote the regeneration of their own seed? In other words, of their own kin? Could they recognize their own kin? And so I've had a number of graduate students working with myself and Dr. Susan Dudley, who is a prof at McMaster University, and looking at kin recognition in Douglas fir forests. And it turns out that they can actually recognize which seedlings are their own and actually create a more favorable environment for their regeneration. So it affects their adaptive traits and their ability to compete with the root systems of the old trees. They actually form bigger mycorrhizal networks, and they actually grow and have a little bit better nutrition than stranger seedlings. And so all of this research, the fact that these old trees are connected all together, that they form a network that new seedlings regenerate in, and that they can favor their own kin, led us to start calling these old trees mother trees. So next slide, please. And these mother trees, and this is just a diagram showing that actually there's a lot of back and forth transmission, not only of carbon and nitrogen and water, but also other information signals. For example, the kin recognition signals, we think, are transmitted through the roots and through the mycorrhizal network. We also know that defense signaling can actually be transmitted from one seedling or one tree to the seedling. So if the old trees are injured by budworms or pathogens, or even mechanically, we actually ripped needles off of these trees, and these trees then transmit information to the surrounding seedlings, conveying to them that there is an herbivore in the presence or a pathogen, and those seedlings then upregulate their defense genes, produce more defense enzymes, and this protects them against that herbivore or pathogen. Next slide, please. So this work we did in Douglas fir forest, but I have to say that all over the world, doesn't matter if you're in a Douglas fir forest in the interior of British Columbia, if you're in a western red cedar forest on the coast of British Columbia, like this picture on the left by Dr. Teresa Ryan, who I work with closely. She's a Tsimshian native woman. It doesn't, whether you're in the Amazon rainforest, or if you're in Europe, or if you're in the United States in the coastal redwoods, these networks exist throughout the world. And the First Nations, this is a picture by April White. She is an artist, and she's a Haida woman, And she's just showing the relationship between the Haida people, salmon, and cedar, which is what her canoe is made of. And it turns out, that as I mentioned before, the salmon actually ends up, or the nitrogen from these salmon ends up in these trees, and it shows the tight linkages between all these creatures, all these relations, whether you're trees, salmon, people, cedar, and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, so these connections are extremely important, but as I mentioned earlier in my talk, forestry is actually, doesn't always pay attention to these connections and actually disconnects forests. The planting or the clear cutting and taking all of the trees. This is a recent clear cut on Haida Gwaii, actually a couple of years ago. The replanting of single species, or these little plugs that don't naturally regenerate. The spraying of herbicides. All of that is about disconnection in forests. And so, the people are upset. So next slide, please. And the Haida people and people, right now in British Columbia, there's also protests going on in southern Vancouver Island, are pretty upset. A lot of them are upset about the planned clear cutting of these forests. And I postulate, and I have a lot of research to show this, that there are different ways to do this, that we don't have to clear cut. We can actually save a lot of trees that can serve as legacies, the mother trees that will help regenerate and renew the forest. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm sorry about all the glitches in the presentation, but thank you so much for your patience and for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's so fascinating, and especially how this research, how it contributed to the field, because before this, we thought everything was in competition with everything else. And then of course it's like, well, actually, no, there can be cooperation too, which just changed kind of everything. So I have some questions of my own to ask, but everyone who's watching, please do put your questions in the chat and I will try and ask them. The first question I had was, does the age of a tree affect its ability to communicate?
Well, yeah. So what we found was that the biggest and oldest trees are the hubs of these networks. And so the older trees tend to be the larger trees, and they have huge root systems. And so these root systems are the most highly connected to their neighbors. Not only that, older trees have got fungi associated with them that are kind of old growth fungi. So, young plantations have got a simpler community of fungal networks, only a few species, whereas the old forests have hundreds of species. And some of them are old growth fungi that form these big pipelines between trees, these connections that are kind of like, they're like pipelines where information can rapidly transmit from one tree to the other. And we have found in our experiments that communication happens within hours. It's almost immediate, or it's going all the time. But when there's an injury or information needs to be passed along about, if there's an insect or a pathogen in the forest, that information is transmitted within hours. So yes, it does matter how old the tree is, because it affects the fungi associated with them, how robust they are, and how they actually work.
Right, because I was curious, how like when you get to, old age in humans or other animals, you get worse. But it sounds like with the trees, they're just getting better and better with age.
That's right. And more than just this way too, right? There's the networks, but they also have these other properties. Like they are host to a wide diversity of other species, not just fungi, but birds and mammals. Even bears will find nests in old trees. So they're a scaffolding for biodiversity, but they also sequester lots and lots of carbon, and they store it below ground. In fact, these old growth forests are the biggest storehouses of carbon along the West Coast. And, so is the boreal forest, but the West Coast forests are special in that they're so productive that a large portion of our carbon is actually stocked away in these forests.
Right. And we have some questions coming in from the audience here. So we have a question from YouTube, which is, generally, how deep is the soil in the temperate rainforest? When they clear cut, do the fungal organisms in the soil die?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's two questions in there. So our soils in Canada are glaciated soils, except for small fringes along the coast, like Haida Gwaii was not glaciated on Vancouver Island, but the rest of Canada was glaciated. And so the soils are considered quite young. That means they haven't had a lot of time, only 10,000 years, to weather and mineralize and create nice fertile soils. And so the soils generally are quite rocky and stony, and often they only go down to about 1 meter deep before you hit parent material or rock or conglomerates of rock. And as you get further or closer to the coastal regions, the soils get deeper and more fertile. And what happens when to the fungi when these forests are clear cut or burned in wildfires? Well, as long as there's plants coming back, like trees where there's photosynthate being produced and that energy is transmitted below ground to these fungal symbionts, they remain alive. And over time, there's a succession of the fungal species. More and more species are actually able to join into a tree because, even if they require a lot of carbon, because the tree gets better and better, bigger crowns that can provide carbon to these bigger fungi. But if there are no plants coming back, those fungi can die off within about a year. So if you leave a forest, if you clear cut a forest, leave it fallow, take all the plants away using herbicides, then actually the diversity goes way down. And then if there's no plants coming back, those fungi will die within about a year.
Right. So is there a window then when you clear cut that you should really, if you're going to replant, you should replant within that window before the fungal networks start to
Yes,
die?
exactly. Yes, it has to. We should be replanting quickly, and in fact, I think that now forestry practices are geared that way. That replanting does happen within about a year, and that's really good because then the seedlings will become colonized right away. Naturally regenerated trees, that is from seed, they become colonized within a couple of months, and they have very diverse mycorrhizal systems compared to the planted seedlings. But yes. With normal forestry practices, it usually isn't a problem to get these seedlings colonized.
Right. We have another question, which I'm quite excited for you to answer because I was quite excited when I read it in your book. But will different species of trees be connected via mycelium to other species?
Yeah, they can be, of course. In fact, this is where I first started my work, is I was looking at mixtures of species. So yeah, there's many tree species, of course, that grow together in diverse communities. And of the fungi, there are some fungi that we call generalists, mycorrhizal fungi. So that just means that they can be associate, or they can colonize, or be associated with many tree species. And those fungi that are generalists can link up different trees, like paper birch and Douglas fir is what I studied, and they transmit carbon back and forth between each other. And, you might say, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense, because why would a tree give carbon to another species? That wouldn't be very good for its, evolutionary advantages. But it turns out, that they actually move carbon back and forth, right? It moves back and forth over the course of hours, even a day, over weeks, over seasons. And so and then over the lifetime of the trees, as they grow up and become from seedlings to mother trees, there can be a transfer from the old trees into the new seedlings that might be of a different species. And so there is a lot of this, this back and forth that is good for the whole community. It keeps the whole community diverse and healthy.
Right. And that answers like some other questions which are coming in as well, saying do different species of trees cooperate, which is yes.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Yeah.
So we have a question from Facebook, which is, could Dr. Simard please explain the nature of the signaling in the mycorrhizal network? Is it based on chemical transmission?
Yeah, so all of the work I've done has been on chemistry. And most of those molecules that we've been looking at are carbon-based or organic molecules. So amino acids, for example, are the main compounds that move through the network. Nitrogen and carbon linked together in amino acids. But there's also other information molecules. We don't really know the structure of all of them, but most of them we think that they're mostly carbon-based, or they have a carbon backbone. In the defense signaling molecules, we think that it's either a byproduct of the jasmonic acid or the salicylic acid pathways, which are pathways that are defense pathways for producing defense enzymes or defense molecules. And those are carbon-based molecules that we think move through the network. And then, of course, the recognition information, whether you're related or not, I mentioned that those also, we've done studies where we've seen that carbon will move between sibling pairs. And so those information signals we think are also carbon-based. Right.
It's so interesting because it's like a neural network, but it's trees.
Yeah, it actually is patterned on a pattern of a neural network. So neural networks are really just a pattern, right? It's a biological neural network, just like our brains are neural networks too. We normally think neural networks are just brains, but actually this patterning in the forest where you have a few big hubs or big old mother trees and a lot of satellite nodes, that patterning, if you analyze it using graph theory, it shows that it is a biological neural network. And these neural networks are really highly evolved networks. They're evolved for resilience. They're evolved for efficiency and rapidity of information travel. And so, yeah, because they work, you actually see them across many kinds of systems, not just brains, but also in the soil, even our man-made systems that are made of networks like Facebook or transportation networks. Those are also designed after neural networks.
Talking of, human-made things, we have a comment in from Mary on YouTube. Would you be able to comment on urban trees and whether there is connections or communications between trees when so isolated with great distances between them, with often concrete and roads between them too?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I actually haven't looked at urban trees before, but I can infer what I think. I think, a lot of urban trees are planted in really horrible soil. You might not even call it soil. It can be like fill or parent material and, really without much organic material, not living soil. And so those trees that are planted into that awful material, it's really hard for them to form mycorrhizas. You might get spores coming in, but there's certainly no hyphae in the soil that would colonize the root tips. And so they tend to be very isolated. That said, these mycorrhizas are pretty ingenious. And if you find a crack through the soil or underground across a road, I think that these trees can actually link up. And the reason I think that, just watch their root systems, right? If a tree lives for a long time, it starts to buckle up the pavement. It actually finds its way to get to water and nutrients. And so the mycorrhizas eventually would associate with those trees as well. But I think that we can do a lot better with urban trees. We know that, that we have to replace these urban trees well before their natural lifespan because they're just not very healthy. And I would say that, growing them in better soil with mycorrhizas, but also in communities, because, what this work all shows is that forests are very social places, that trees like to grow together in communities and communicate with each other. And it's out of that community that emerges their good health and thriftiness. Mm-hmm.
So what could people be doing in their own gardens, say, that could kind of help with this, like creating a network or almost a family, I guess, of trees or plants?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do. And actually in my book, I talk a little bit about something that I've tried to do, which is adopting the Aboriginal people's a way of growing gardens in clusters, and Robin Wall Kimmer, in her book called Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about the three sisters, and these are corn, beans, and squash that actually form arbuscular mycorrhizas, and they can all link together in a community, but they help each other out. So the beans will fix nitrogen that provides this nutrition to the corn plants, which then grow tall, fix a lot of carbon through their big leaves that photosynthesize. And that photosynthetic energy then feeds the network and supports in the squash plants and the bean plants, and the squashes provide sort of a mulching effect on the soil that keeps it moist. And so these three plants work together beautifully to create this very productive community. And, most of our garden plants are, our vegetable plants, they do form arbuscular mycorrhizas, which is a very fine, special group of mycorrhizas. Not all of the plants are mycorrhizal naturally, but a lot of them are. And the other thing that we can do in our gardens to promote these networks and to promote the connection and community is to not overwater them or add fertilizers, because when you do that, the plants don't need their mycorrhizas as much, right? They'll just rely on the inputs we provide them. And so if you want to promote a more natural garden that is sustainable and can keep going without you adding fertilizer, then you should promote the mycorrhizal network by, having good compost, good soil with inoculum, and good patterns of how you plant your plants so that they are companions to each other.
Right. Okay, we have a fantastic question in from YouTube. I think it's a good question. So how does this understanding of the interconnection and interdependence within a forest change how we deal with conservation? Should a whole forest versus one species be considered endangered?
That's a really good question. You can have whole endangered ecosystems. In fact, in British Columbia, where I'm from, the coastal Douglas fir ecosystems are almost all extirpated. They've been, and they are host to a wide diversity of plants. A lot of them are species at risk or endangered or extinct. And so those whole ecosystems, they really do function as a whole. And the Okanagan ecosystems, again, through urban development, farming, growing vineyards, fruit trees, and so on, that has actually, really endangered those ecosystems too. So yes, they are connected whole systems that need to be preserved intact, or at least, conserved anyway, so that they're more intact. And I would argue, right across all the ecosystems, they do serve as a functioning whole unit, right? They're not a single organism, but they're an integrated ecosystem where they all work together, have good relationships with each other, and produce a diverse and productive community.
Right. So we have a few people who are particularly interested in mother trees and identifying them. And maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about your mother tree project that is basically doing exactly this.
Yes. So, I mentioned in my talk that clear cutting is the standard forestry practice. And it has been ever since the 1970s. In fact, it's it's still very prevalent today, even though there is a rule where we're supposed to, retain about 10% of the trees. But often those trees are, they're the ones that are not wanted, or they're on a rocky hill slope, or, they're in a bog, or, they're not really serving as like the centers of the forest. And so we're actually trying to find alternatives to this. Like, how else can we do this? Can we save these mother trees? And so I have this experiment that's called the Mother Tree Project that crosses this big climate gradient, and we're trying different ways in these different ecosystems to save these old trees, either by themselves or in groups or larger groups. And how would that look like as climate changes, in order to keep these forests resilient and healthy? At the same time, we're also migrating species into these forests. So we're taking genotypes from warmer climates and moving them in. And we're finding that, even though these migrated genotypes or seedlings are very vulnerable, because the new ecosystems are not always, well adapted to them, but we're trying to move them so they can keep up with climate change, that the old mother trees actually protect them. And it increases their survival rate by quite a lot, by at least 20%. So in combination, the saving of the old trees and then helping trees and plants migrate as climate changes, I think is a really good approach for making sure that our forests stay healthy as we move forward.
Right. And you've mentioned climate change, and that kind of made me think, obviously fire is like a part of the cycle of, of our forests in BC, like it's a natural part of the forest, but is increased wildfire something that will damage this network, not just above ground of the trees, but the network below ground too?
Yeah. So, these ecosystems are all fire origin ecosystems. That means that they're adapted to fire, right? They actually require fire to keep them renewed and healthy and vigorous. But of course, as climate is changing, it's getting hotter. Our precipitation patterns are changing. Some ecosystems are getting drier. And also with fire suppression, we've actually increased the fuel loads. And so we've actually created conditions for more severe fires in the than in the past, and more extensive fires. So normally under the normal fire regime or the historic fire regime, then we call it the natural range of variability, these mycorrhizal networks easily regenerate. You know, in a normal fire, you have lots of patches that are left behind. The fire is usually not a scorched earth for kilometers and kilometers. And so these old remnants will actually provide the networks that the new regeneration just regenerates right into it, taps into it, just like in that map I showed you. And so they regenerate really, really quickly. But when we're getting into kind of this newer fire regime where the fires seem to be more severe and more extensive, then if it burns right down through the forest floor and right into the mineral soil, you actually can lose inoculum. And in that case, you know, it would be good to try to reintroduce some of that inoculum or bring native inoculum in from surrounding forests to make sure that the seedlings that are coming up actually have a good head start.
Right. The other thing that quite a lot of people are asking, and I mean, I feel like I've read your book, so I'm cheating, but what are the kind of responses to your research from, you know, forestry companies or governments? Do you feel like your research has, you know, contributed to changing the practices at all?
Well, I would say if you look at what's happening on the landscape, that we're still, you know, not leaving old trees that are valuable, big old trees. We're still taking them. We're still clear cutting for the most part. That, you know, if I look at it across the board, I would say it hasn't been very well adopted, these ideas. But that's why I've got the Mother Tree Project, is trying to provide an example and places where people can come and see what this looks like, that there are solutions, that alternatives to clear cutting. And so I'm hoping that with public pressure on governments not to clear cut more old growth or to take more old growth, and to reduce the amount of clear cutting, reduce the cut level, that there will be a pressure that can, you know, sort of move things in a different direction so that this new science is better adopted. It'll make for healthier forests in the future. Right.
Gosh, so many people are so curious about this. There's a lot of questions this evening. One person, Mark from YouTube, is asking whether you can maybe talk about intelligence and whether trees have intelligence in a way that is comparable to humans.
Yeah, so I've used the word intelligence quite a bit, and I use it scientifically, right? So, you know, I mentioned that the networks in the soil are biological neural networks. They're patterned after neural networks, and the amino acids that are moving through these networks, the nitrogen and carbon, a lot of it is glutamate, which is actually one of our neurotransmitters, and so there are these similarities with our own intelligence, and these systems are highly evolved to have these patterns, right? Because they work at helping regenerate forests, to heal forests from disturbance, to transmit information across whole forests so that it can be responsive and perceptive and adaptive and change with sudden changes in the environment, for example. And so, you know, those highly evolved systems work, you know, they evolve because they work. And so, you know, that to me, that they have all the hallmarks of intelligence, not just the patterning and the chemistry is so similar and keeping in mind that they aren't, you know, they're not nervous systems, they're not brains, but they have patterns that are similar, and that they're perceptive. Trees are perceptive and responsive, and they can, you know, they can learn, they can adapt and change, and so all of those things have the hallmarks of intelligence, which is a word that normally we ascribe to ourselves, to only people, or maybe our pets too. Oh, my cat is so smart, but that word, you know, for lack of better words in the English language, that is the word that I think is the best, most apt to describe this. And I'll add one more thing, in that the ancient languages that were, you know, among our First Nations, you know, they understood these connections. This was like the, you know, an underpinning of their worldviews, that we're all connected as one. And they had, from what I understand from talking to to some of my friends who are First Nations that there were words in their languages that described these phenomena that were this sort of intelligence, but they had their own words for it. And so they, we didn't have to borrow, human words to describe things that they were seeing among their relations or the trees and the forest.
Totally. And I feel like it's just one of those classic things where we have ignored traditional wisdom, and of course, yes, they were always right.
Yes, exactly. Yes, there's definitely a lesson for us there, and really, I'm hopeful that the work that I'm doing can help us understand that wisdom a little better, accept it a little. I mean, we sort of have learned to in our Western civilization to trust Western science, and we reduce this reductionist science where we actually see these things moving around, to pay more attention to what historically we have ignored or described as mystique or mysterious or folklore or myths. Those are not myths, right? These are embedded in Aboriginal science, right? This is an opportunity for us to see that and to work with our Aboriginal people who know so much more about the land than we do, that Western civilization has brought over from Europe. That it is going to be a key for us to combine forces and move forward together as one.
Yeah, I think so. We have like a fun question. What is the most exciting part of your research?
The most exciting part, well, those discoveries, right? That you do so much work in science. There's so much grunt work. I would say that hard labor, which I love the hard labor. That maybe I'm odd in that way, but there's nothing better to me than being in the forest and maybe digging a soil pit and collecting samples. But other than that, when you get your data and you're looking at the patterns and that aha moment comes, and you go, oh my goodness, the map, for example, oh my goodness, those trees are all connected together. Those are the funnest moments when you're just going, oh my God, this is going to change the world.
Right. And talking of changing the world, and I feel like I have to ask this question, and I think other people in the comments have too, is Avatar. Is it fair to say that your work kind of inspired that?
From what I understand, it was an inspiration, yes. So when Avatar first came out, the first movie, I actually got a phone call from somebody who was working with James Cameron and was in the workshops when they were developing the ideas of the science behind Avatar. And they had my paper. And so they were looking at the paper. And I think that was, part of the underpinning of the home tree and the connection with the Na'vi people. And since then, so James Cameron is going on to make three or at least maybe three more Avatar movies. And we're actually making a documentary film, and I'm part of that film on the science behind Avatar. So I think that, yes, I think that's enough evidence to say that, yeah, it was an inspiration for Avatar.
And did you see any kind of, I guess, fallout from Avatar? Is like, because that there is science behind there, and did you kind of see an understanding kind of spread into the general public from that?
I think so. I think that people love that movie, right? Because not just because of the helicopters and the floating islands, but because of that connection that we all feel, and we know that we are all connected. I think in our hearts we know that, and so I think that aha. I know that when I went to see the movie, and I wasn't part of making the movie, but I put on those glasses and I went, oh my God, he totally gets this. We are all connected together. And so I think the popularity of the movie, really spoke to our hearts, that what we know deep inside of us, in our DNA, we evolved from connection and relationships. So yeah, I think it did. I think it really helped.
And talking of film, I read that your book is actually going to be adapted into a film. And how do you feel? Because your book is about trees, but it's also about your life. It is a deeply personal book. And how do you kind of feel about that being portrayed on a big screen?
I don't know what to feel. I mean, it's like so exciting and thrilling, and it's beyond my wildest dreams that this would actually become a feature film in Hollywood. But you know what? I think it's fantastic because it will bring it to everybody, right? It will make all these ideas accessible to everybody who wants to go see the film, and that's what we need. We need people to reconnect with nature, and you know, all the media, the films, the poetry, the books, the symphonies, the songs, the artwork, that's all important in getting people to understand this connection, to go and be reconnected with nature, and then fight for nature like we are obligated to do for our very own lives and our children and the next generations. So I'm thrilled. I think it's great.
Definitely. And I think probably we need to wrap up, but I guess the question which a few people have asked is, what can people do, you know, kind of on an everyday, like, can people volunteer for the Mother Tree Project, or can we do things, you know, within ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things everybody can do, big and small. And so like the small things, the first thing is just go find a tree or a plant, and just be, you know, learn to respect that plant again, because you evolved from those plants. They're your ancestors, and they deserve our respect. So that's a key to change. I think that's a key to see change in attitudes from being an exploitive kind of society to a more regenerative kind of society. And so that's the first thing. And then the next thing, you know, the big thing is, you know, governments make decisions for us. Governments are there to work for the people, right? And the governments sometimes get really mixed up and they start serving big corporate interests instead of what's good for the people and good for the planet. And we need to make sure we vote properly so that we don't have regressive governments. Or if you do have a progressive government, hold their feet to the fire. If they made promises, like our government made promises about fossil fuels, and in British Columbia, our provincial government made promises about not cutting old growth, but they're not fulfilling their promises. And so people need to go to them and say, hey, you know, you need to keep your promises because this is important for all of us. Like, I want a healthy place for my kids. I don't want you to be pandering to big special interests and big corporate interests. You know, it's the people first. So yes, that's a small example, and that's a big example, and there's many things in between as well. But yeah, I'll just stop at that.
Well, I feel like we could chat about this forever, but we do have to wrap up. So thank you so much, Dr. Simard, for joining us this evening, and thank you everyone who tuned in. And oh my gosh, a cat.
That's so sweet.
I knew this was going to happen at one point this evening because it has in every talk I've done.
That's awesome.
Okay, so thank you everyone for watching. I'd like to also take this opportunity to mention that as a non-profit organisation, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society is greatly appreciative of any support you can offer. So visit rcgs.org/donate if you're able to help keep us putting on events like this. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much.